What happens when a country of just 5.5 million people scares one of the most powerful militaries on Earth? Somewhere along an 830-mile bow order, Russian generals look at a map, and then they look away. Something there makes them nervous. Something there makes them stop. Before we go further, hit that like button right now. Not because I asked nicely, but because this story has a twist near the end that most people never hear, and you won't want to miss it. Subscribe if you like uncovering the real story behind the headlines, and send this to one friend who thinks small countries can't stand up to giants. Let's begin. Picture a map of Europe. On one side, Russia, a nation with the largest army by sheer numbers in the world, thousands of tanks, a stockpile of nuclear weapons, and a leader who has already shown he's willing to invade a neighbor. On the other side, Finland, a quiet, snowy country famous for saunas, forests, and some of the happiest people on the planet. It doesn't sound like a fair fight. On paper, Russia should be able to walk in whenever it wants, take what it wants, and be done within a week. But here's the strange part. Russia hasn't touched Finland. Not one soldier has crossed that border since the alarm bells started ringing across Europe in 2022. And the deeper you look into why, the more you realize this isn't luck. It isn't mercy. It's something Finland built on purpose over decades, brick by brick, bunker by bunker, soldier by soldier. Almost like the entire nation knew this exact moment was coming, long before anyone else believed it could. To understand why Putin hesitates, you have to go back to a winter almost nobody remembers correctly. In 1939, the Soviet Union, Russia's earlier form, decided Finland would be an easy target. Stalin had a massive army, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, backed by tanks, aircraft, and artillery that Finland simply could not match. Finland, by comparison, had barely any tanks, barely any planes, and a population smaller than many single Russian cities. Soviet commanders reportedly expected the whole operation to be finished in less than 2 weeks. Some ACC-ounts say Soviet troops were even told to bring parade uniforms because they assumed the celebration in Helsinki would come that quickly. It did not go that way. Finnish soldiers, dressed in white to disappear into the snow, moved on skis through frozen forests the invaders didn't understand. They knew every lake, every ridge, every hidden path, because they had grown up on that exact land. They seed the freezing cold as a weapon, striking fast, then vanishing back into the trees before the enemy could regroup. Soviet columns got trapped on narrow forest roads, unable to turn their vehicles around, and Finnish fighters picked them apart from the tree line in what became known as the Moti tactic, surrounding and slowly destroying isolated groups of enemy soldiers, piece by piece. The war lasted months, not days. The Soviets eventually won territory, forcing Finland to give up land in the final peace agreement, but at a staggering cost. Historians estimate Soviet losses were many times higher than Finland's, a humiliating outcome for a superpower fighting a country a fraction of its size. It became one of the most studied military embarrassments of the 20th century, a warning sign that raw numbers don't guarantee victory. That war left a permanent mark on Finland's national memory. It taught them something no textbook could teach. Survival is not about how big your army is. It's about how ready your entire country is, down to the last citizen. And Finland never forgot that lesson, while much of Europe relaxed after the Cold War ended, tore down bunkers, shrank their militaries, and assumed peace was permanent. Finland did the opposite. They kept preparing. Quietly, patiently, like someone who never quite trusts that the storm is really over, even when the skies look clear. That single decision, made decades ago and quietly maintained through generations of governments, is a huge part of why today's Finland looks less like a small Nordic nation and more like a fortress hiding in plain sight. Let's talk numbers because they matter here, and they're more surprising than most people expect. Finland's active standing military isn't enormous on its own. It doesn't need to be, but its reserve system is where things get extraordinary. Nearly every Finnish man goes through mandatory military training, typically lasting several months to a year, and the training doesn't disappear the moment service ends. Reservists are called back periodically for refresher exercises throughout their lives, keeping their skills sharp for decades. Call it up in a real crisis, and Finland can put close to 1 million trained people into the defense of the coup and try. For a nation of just 5.5 million citizens, that means an almost unheard of percentage of the entire population is ready to fight. And fight in terrain they've trained on their entire lives, not some unfamiliar battlefield thousands of miles from home. Compare that to how a modern war usually plays out. An invading force needs supply lines stretching back to its own territory. It needs fuel, forward, spare parts, and ammunition moving constantly forward. Finland's geography makes every single one of those things a nightmare for an outsider. Dense forests stretch for hundreds of miles. Thousands of lakes break up the landscape, forcing vehicles onto narrow, predictable roads. Long, brutal winters bring limited daylight and temperatures that can freeze engines solid, crack. rubber, and turn ordinary movement into a slow, exhausting struggle. This isn't open desert where tanks can spread out and roll for miles unopposed. It's a landscape built by nature to punish anyone who doesn't belong there. And Finnish forces have spent generations training specifically to fight in it, while an invading army would be learning the hard way, in real time, under fire. Then there are the bunkers. This is the detail that stops people in their tracks every time they hear it. Finland has built and maintained an enormous network of underground shelters. Reports point to tens of thousands of them scattered across the country, with the capital city alone able to shelter almost its entire civilian population underground, far beyond what its actual population requires. These aren't rusted old Cold War leftovers sitting forgotten and half collapsed. Many of them are used every single day, woven directly into ordinary civilian life. Underground parking garages that convert into bomb shelters within hours. Swimming pools and sports centers built directly above blast-proof concrete walls thick enough to withstand direct strikes. Children play in bunker basements without even realizing what they're really standing inside. Local bands rehearse in rooms that double as emergency command centers. Here's why that detail matters so much. A military can be defeated, soldiers can retreat, surrender, or be worn down over time. But a population that has spent it Nario, hiding, adapting, surviving underground for extended periods if necessary, becomes so, meaning much harder to break psychologically and practically. Finland didn't just build an army, it built a country that refuses to be shocked by war, because it has been mentally and physically preparing, and for one, quietly, for generations, in a way that has become simply normal, unremarkable background noise to everyday life. We're just getting started, and the next part is where this story gets even more interesting. The part about what EH anged in 2023, and why it terrifies Moscow more than anything else on this list. But first, if this video has already got you something you didn't expect, drop a comment with just one word. Fortress? So I know you're still with me. It genuinely helps this video reach more people, and I read every single one. For decades, Finland stayed officially neutral. It didn't join NATO, the military alliance built to defend its members against Saint attack. That neutrality wasn't weakness. It was strategy, a careful diplomatic balancing act that let Finland avoid provoking its enormous neighbor while quietly keeping its own defenses razor sharp behind the scenes. It was a delicate walk, maintained for over 70 years, through Cold War tension, through the collapse of the Soviet Union, through decades of shifting European politics. Then Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. Almost overnight, that old balance shattered. Finland watched a neighboring country get invaded by the same power that had invaded Finland itself back in 1939. Public opinion, which had leaned strongly against NATO membership for decades, flipped almost instantly. Finnish leaders came to a blunt, urgent conclusion. Neutrality only protects you if the other side respects boundaries. If it doesn't, neutrality just makes you a more convenient, isolated target with no formal allies bound to respond. So Finland did something it hadn't seriously considered in generations. It applied to join NATO. And in April 2023, after a swift and historic ratification process, it officially became a member, doubling the alliance's direct land border with Russia in a single stroke. Understand what that actually means. NATO's entire foundation is built on one core promise, written into Article 5 of its founding treaty. An attack on one member is treated as an attack on all of them. The moment Finland joined, its 83.0-mile border with Russia effectively became NATO's border too. Suddenly, invading Finland wasn't a regional decision Russia could make on its own terms and contain locally. It would risk triggering a direct confrontation with the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and dozens of other militaries bound by treaty to respond, potentially pulling the entire alliance into open conflict. Overnight, Russia's northwestern border, once bordered by a cautious, neutral neighbor, became border AD by one of the most heavily armed alliances in human history. And there was nothing Moscow could do to reverse it. Diplomatic warnings, veiled threats, and cutting off electricity exports to Finland in a symbolic act of retaliation. None of it mattered. Finland made its decision, and NATO welcomed them in within record time, faster than almost any nation in the alliance's history. This is where the real tension sits, because on the surface, this looks like a simple story. Small country joins big alliance protects small country. But it's more complicated than that. Alliances only work if the country joining them is actually capable of standing its ground long enough for help to arrive. NATO doesn't have soldiers pre-stationed on every single inch of every border, ready to appear in seconds the moment shots are fired. If Finland collapsed in the opening days of an invasion, Allied support might arrive too late to matter, and the entire promise of collective defense could unravel in the worst possible way. This is exactly why Finland's own military strength is so critical, not despite NATO membership, but because of it. Finland isn't relying purely on the promise that others will show up eventually. It has built a country that can hold the line on its own for as long as it takes, buying time, absorbing pressure, refusing to break under the first wave of any assault. NATO is the safety net. Finland's own million-strong reserve force, its bunkers, its brutal terrain, and its national mindset are the wall that has to stand first before anyone else even arrives. Now, think about this from Putin's side of the table for a moment. What does an invasion of Finland actually look like, realistically, if he ordered it tomorrow morning? His forces would need to cross a border stretching hundreds of miles, much of it dense forest and frozen wilderness that Finnish troops know intimately and Russian troops do not. The W would be fighting not just a professional army, but potentially hundreds of thousands of trained reservists who could be mobilized within days, arriving with local knowledge no invading force could replicate. Civilians would have access to a shelter network built to withstand exactly this kind of assault, keeping the population sheltered, organized, and resistant to the kind of chaos that usually breaks a country's will early in a war. And the second serious fighting broke out, NATO's collective defense clause would be triggered, pulling in military support from across 2 continents, transforming a regional invasion into a potential world crisis. And there's one more brutal fact hanging over all of this. Russia's military has already spent years fighting in Ukraine, a war that has cost it enormous numbers of soldiers, huge amounts of equipment, the tanks, aircraft, and ammunition stockpiles that took decades to build and cannot be quickly replaced. Independent estimates have placed Russian casualties and losses in Ukraine at levels not seen since World War II, with entire tank divisions rebuilt from museum-pie ECEs and Soviet-era storage yards just to keep pace. That means the very army that would need to invade Finland is the same army that has already been worn down, equipment-starved, and stretched thin fighting a country with a fraction of Finland's preparation and none of its NATO backing. So when people ask, why doesn't Putin just invade Finland? They're often missing the real answer. It's not that Russia respects Finland's independence out of kindness or restraint. It's that the math doesn't work and hasn't W-orked for years. The cost would be catastrophic, the outcome uncertain, and the risk of dragging in the world's most powerful military alliance would be almost guaranteed. Finland didn't get lucky. Finland made itself too expensive, too dangerous, and too complicated to be worth attacking, one careful decision at a time, across nearly a century. There's something else worth sitting with here, something bigger than tanks and troop numbers. Finland's entire approach to defense is built on an idea most modern countries have quietly abandoned. The belief that every citizen has a role in protecting the nation, not just the people in uniform. This is sometimes called comprehensive security, and it's woven into nearly every layer of Finnish society. It's a philosophy where the government, private businesses, schools, hospitals, and everyday citizens are all wired into a shared plan for what happens during a crisis. Emergency food reserves are maintained year-round, quietly rotated and restocked, without most citizens even thinking about it. Fuel and medical supply stockpiles exist in case supply chains break down for weeks or months. Regular citizens receive guidance on what to do if the power grid fails, if communication lines go dark, or if they need to shelter underground for an extended period. It's not paranoia. It's preparation, treated as a normal, unremarkable part of daily life, the same way other countries treat fire drills or seatbelt laws. Contrast that with how much of the Western world approached security after the Cold War ended. Militaries shrank dramatically. Civil defense budgets were slashed to almost nothing. Underground shelters were converted into parking garages, storage units, or simply sealed off and forgotten entirely. The general assumption across much of Europe was that scale war on the continent was a relic of the past, something that belonged in history books, not modern planning meetings or municipal budgets. Finland never made that assumption. And when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the rest of Europe suddenly understood why. Countries that had let their defenses erode for 30 years were forced to scramble, rebuilding stockpiles, reconsidering conscription, questioning decisions made in more optimistic times. Finland didn't need to scramble. It had never stopped preparing in the first place, and its systems were already built, tested, and ready to activate. This is the deeper story behind the numbers everyone quotes. The million reserve troops, the tens of thousands of bunkers, the fighter jets, the artillery. Those numbers are real, and they matter enormously. But they're really just the visible surface of something much bigger, a national mindset that treats security not as an occasional concern during moments of crisis, but as a permanent, ongoing responsibility woven into everyday citizenship. Finland isn't just armed, it's prepared in a way that goes far beyond weapons and reaches into how the entire society thinks, plans, and behaves, generation after generation. That's the piece most people miss when they hear a headline like, "Why can't Putin invade Finland?" They picture tanks lined up at a border, generals staring each other down through binoculars. But the real deterrent isn't just the tanks. It's the fact that Finland has built a society where invasion wouldn't just mean fighting an army. It would mean fighting an entire nation that has been quietly rehearsing for this exact moment for generations, down to the school children who know exactly which building to run to. If you're finding this as fascinating as I did while researching it, do me a quick favor. Tap that subscribe button, and if you're on mobile, turn on notifications too, because we're covering more stories like this, countries that punch far above their weight and the hidden reasons why. It takes 2 seconds, and it means everything for this channel. Let's talk about the weapon side of this too, because it's not just bunkers and reservists. Finland's military hardware is far more advanced than most people realize for a country its size. It operates a modern fleet of F-35 fighter jets, among the most sophisticated combat aircraft ever built, giving it serious air power despite its small population, and replacing an older fleet with cutting-edge stealth technology that few nations in the world possess. Its artillery capability is enormous, with some estimates suggesting Finland's combined artillery strength rivals, or even exceeds that of countries many times its size, like France or Germany. In a region where dense terrain limits fast troop movement, artillery becomes one of the most decisive tools available on the battlefield, and Finland has invested heavily in exactly that for decades, never letting that capability slip. Add to this Finland's deep integration with NATO's broader defense network, shared intelligence, joint training exercises conducted regularly with allied forces across the region, standardized equipment and communication systems that allow Finnish forces to coordinate seamlessly with allied troops if support ever needed to arrive in a hurry. This isn't a country bolted onto an alliance as an afterthought, still learning the ropes. Finland has spent years preparing its military to slot directly into NATO's command structure, meaning that if conflict ever broke out, coordination wouldn't be a slow, clumsy, confused process. It would be near instant, practiced, and rehearsed. Now step back and look at the whole picture together, all at once. A population trained almost entirely in national defense, refreshed regularly throughout their adult lives. A landscape that punishes invaders and rewards defenders who know every inch of it. A shelter network capable of protecting nearly the entire population from direct attack for extended periods. Modern fighter jets and artillery that rival much larger nations with far bigger populations and budgets. Full integration into the most powerful military alliance on Earth, with coordination already tested and proven, and an national culture that has never let its guard down, not for one single year since the Winter War ended over 80 years ago. That is not a country waiting to be conquered. That is a country that has spent nearly a century quietly building the exact defenses needed for this exact moment in history, almost as if it always knew this day might come. So when you ask why Putin hasn't invaded Finland, the honest answer isn't really about mercy or diplomacy or Russia simply choosing not to out of goodwill. It's about consequences, calculated coldly and repeatedly by military planners in Moscow. Every serious analysis of a Finland invasion leads to the same brutal conclusion for Russian strategists. Massive casualties, an already drained and stretched military, a guaranteed NATO response pulling in dozens of nations, and no clear path to actually holding the territory, even if initial ground were gained in the first chaotic days. Finland turned itself into a country where the cost of attacking will always outweigh any possible gain, no matter how the numbers are recalculated. And in the language that power understands best, that is the only kind of peace that truly holds over time. There's an old idea in military strategy that the strongest deterrent isn't the biggest army. It's the army, and enemy believes it cannot afford to fight, no matter how it plans the operation. Finland understood this decades before most of the world caught up and started paying attention. While other nations debated budgets and questioned whether old Cold War fears were outdated relics, Finland quietly kept building, kept training, kept preparing. A population that could stand its ground the moment it was ever needed, without fanfare, without headlines, year after year. And maybe that's the real lesson hiding inside this story. Strength doesn't always look like size. Sometimes it looks like your readiness, patience, and consistency, maintained long after everyone else assumes the danger has passed. Sometimes the safest countries on Earth aren't the ones with the biggest armies, but the 1S who never let themselves forget what it costs to be unprepared, even during the calmest, quietest decades of peace. Finland remembers 1939 every single day, in bunkers disguised as swimming pools, in reservists who never fully allow the reserve even decades after their service ends, in forests that still remember exactly how to swallow an invading army whole. It's a quiet kind of power. The kind that doesn't need to shout or parade its weapons through city squares, because everyone watching from across that long, frozen border already understands the message clearly. Putin hasn't invaded Finland. Not because he doesn't want to, but because Finland made absolutely sure he never could without losing far more than he could ever gain in soldiers, in equipment, and in standing on the world stage. And in a world full of loud threats and louder warnings, sometimes the most powerful message a country can send is simply this: come and try. If this video opened your eyes to something you never fully understood before, that's exactly why I make these. Hit like if you learned something today, subscribe if you want more deep dives like this one, and share it with someone who needs to see how a small nation quietly became one of the hardest countries on earth to invade. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I'll see you in the next one.